one word that really comes to mind when I think about AI is that it's irresponsible. I think AI is a useful tool, but there are a lot of places it's been taken that are, I think, very irresponsible because people have a choice as to where they take these algorithms, what they do with them, and how they train them. It's like they're opening Pandora's box. It's like so many problems are coming with it. Maybe there's benefits, but there are already so many issues with our economy, society, and the internet, and we haven't even gone through those yet. And now we're causing so many more issues that need to be dealt with.
Welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. My name is Jonathan Brush, and I'm here with my co-host and producer, David Rethemeyer. And David, we got a new kind of segment to introduce today, don't we?
Yes, we do. We are actually going to be bringing on this time around a couple of the students from our program. These two specific students are from our Equip program, which is our 9th through 11th grade program. And these guys, we do project-based education throughout our entire catalog of programs. And these guys are pretty unique in one of the projects they decided to do, and they decided to start a podcast. So we figured that we would go ahead and say, you know what? Let's go ahead and just invite our podcasting students on our podcast. And hey, maybe the two of us can learn something from them.
And that's what happened. We had a really fun conversation with Zach and Sam. We picked on them because before we started recording, we asked very specifically, because they're Samuel and Zechariah, if we should call them Zach or Sam. And so I asked, what does your mom call you? And Zach said, well, she calls me Zach unless she's mad at Zechariah. So, okay, we'll go with Zach because we're not mad at you. And Sam said, I said, Samuel, what do you call it? He's, well, called Sam. It's fine. And then they referred to each other every single time as Samuel and Zechariah the whole way through. So David and I are on casual terms with them, and they're on more formal terms with each other. But no, these are two very interesting young men. They're very intrigued with bringing their voice, very motivated to bring their voice as homeschool Gen Zers into the kind of marketplace of ideas and discussing some things. They had some very interesting things to say about their generation. We started off talking about their podcast that they started, and their first episode talks about AI. So we have some AI discussion, which, that's a hot topic. David and I obviously have spent 9+ episodes talking about that on another podcast, our Alternative Ideas podcast, if you're interested in the subject. So it's interesting to hear it from the younger generation and their perspective. But then we just asked them some broader questions about what does it mean to be a Gen Z homeschooler, and both of them had some really interesting perspective there, and then also some perspective on what they're hoping for and sort of the things that they see coming in their own lives. And so it was a fun conversation. We're honored and delighted to have them as students, and it was a lot of fun to have them on the podcast. So hope you enjoy our conversation with Zach and Sam. Well, Zach Olson and Sam Bejarano, we are delighted to have you on the Be Unbound podcast. We're even more delighted to have you as a part of the Unbound family, specifically in the Equip program. And we're looking forward to having a conversation today with you guys about several different things. But of course, we got to know you because you're students. And so we're delighted by that. We think that you have absolutely outstanding taste in educational services, but then got some more attention because you recorded a podcast that was pretty interesting. Had to do with artificial intelligence. And David and I have had a little bit of experience and interest in artificial intelligence, having run the Alternative Ideas podcast for, I don't know how many sessions, but we actually did it as a project because we were both curious about it. And it gave us a good excuse to, maybe a good stick to keep us paying attention to AI over the summer and last spring and thinking about it. So welcome, guys. We really appreciate you coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So you guys have got a podcast that you started as part of a project for Unbound, and it's called Much Ado About Nothing. And so I wanted to start and ask, tell me about that title. Is that supposed to be ironic? Is it supposed to be specific, or where did that come from?
Yeah, it was actually kind of funny when we made the podcast. I was doing my schoolwork, and one of the books we just finished reading was Much Ado About Nothing. And then Zechariah comes up to me and like, oh, you know what would be a cool episode for a podcast? Much to do about nothing. And I literally just read the book, so I understood what the title meant and everything, like what's in the story. And then I was like, yeah, it's a pretty good thing. And I was like, okay. But then after reading the book and then looking at the title and what we were doing, I was like, yeah, there's a lot of comparisons between those things.
The idea, I guess, between the title was also just that we have no idea what we're doing specifically with our podcast. So it's just like a lot of things that just kind of random topics that we choose. Maybe they're relevant, maybe they're just things we thought were interesting that we thought other people might find interesting, but just that it's a lot about nothing specifically. So that was kind of the idea.
Well, so you say you're not sure where you're going with the podcast, but to some level, if you start a podcast, you have something you want to say, or you just have some desire to sort of think through something. So tell me a little bit about the motivation behind that. What is it? Maybe not so much you want to stay, what it is that you want to say, but what is it that you want to think through? What was the motivation behind doing something like a podcast?
Well, Samuel and I, we both have a lot of ideas and thoughts that we never really get to talk about. So we thought, apparently, people have told both of us that we should start a podcast. So we thought this is an opportunity to do that. So we might as well try it. And I guess also just the general idea, like theme, is that we're presenting like a view on current relevant topics from a homeschooler Gen Z point of view. So
I think it went back to the parallels of the book. So if you don't know the Shakespeare Went to Do Unbound Nothing, it's actually a book about how someone overhears something else and then it spirals out of control really quickly. So then this person hears, oh, you did this, and then the other person does it, and then the other, and it just turns into a big, huge mess. And what we want to do with the podcast is we want to say something, and maybe that thing could someone hears it and goes, oh, and then it moves on to the next person, and it turns into a big mess, a better mess, unlike the book.
So, so I think, David, the takeaway I got here is that we have a bunch of chaos coordinators here that looking for to create a big mess. No,
Oh, this
Sam,
sounds delightful.
yeah, no, it sounds fantastic, right? No, Sam, I understand. So it's saying something that kind of bounces off somebody who thinks something and then and starts a conversation and hopefully a constructive conversation. I thought you had an interesting conversation around AI. So David and I, as we talked about, did the Alternative Ideas podcast for several episodes, and we might restart it at some point. But at the time we did it, it was because we were seeing AI have a major impact in education, and we were trying to think through the implications AI had for our own lives and our own business, and also then how do we think through that? And it was a good excuse to really focus in, and it was an interesting journey and continues to be, and something that I'm particularly interested in. But tell me some of the things that when you prepare for a podcast that you guys, we were talking before we started record that, when you're doing a podcast, it's like, it seems easy to just have a conversation, but then you have to kind of have an outline. You have to think about it. So it requires some investment and requires some thinking about the subject. So as you were delving into the AI piece, what were some things that jumped out that were surprising or new to you, or maybe even came up during the conversation that you hadn't expected? Because you guys covered a pretty wide range on your episode and hit a couple different pieces of it. So what were some things that surprised you or were particularly interesting?
I like how you hit the head. Like we when we talk about almost everything or nothing, it's the problem is we're kids or we are like considered in the like you said in a quip first stage of life training. We don't know a lot of stuff. So when we talk about a subject, we're not experts in the field. We have a college degree or a university degree of robotics and know about this. We have to research it ourselves. So we take our stuff. We like to say, "Oh yeah, it's a hint of salt. We're just having a conversation and just thinking about what you guys would think about." Because I bet some people listening don't have the same degree as us. And so when we took our stuff and we did it, it was actually pretty good. We learned about like the good of humanity, like the good stuff about robots, the bad stuff about robots, and just a lot of stuff like I don't know. There's a lot of stuff we learned about that we wouldn't have known if we didn't have done that podcast.
I guess also we just going into that podcast, we were going into it looking to learn something. So, because, not everyone knows everything. And so we wanted to, through researching beforehand, be able to learn things and then share that with people.
Sam, when you mentioned the title, Much Ado About Nothing, the Shakespearean play, and then how something happens and then it kind of blows into bigger proportions, to some extent, the AI conversation is very much like that. That, you can't talk about AI without immediately somebody saying the Terminator's coming tomorrow.
Mm.
And the doomsday scenario is just about as bad as anything that technology's ever spawned. I mean, there's always doomsday prophets with new technology, but AI is the kind of thing that, the doomsday prophecy comes 0.3 seconds into whatever conversation you're having about AI. I thought you guys had some interesting points on the podcast. And one of them was this. You talked about, and I can't remember which one of you said this, that, one of the clear distinctives with AI is that AI is pulling from a data set and it is recycling and reconfiguring known ideas. And that makes that's one of the distinctives between humans who come up with new ideas. And then you further went on and you talked about, I can't remember which one of you said this, but that I think you're reading from a Fortune magazine article, that AI has a IQ of 150. Is that correct? Was that the right number?
I think so. I do.
And so there's an interesting contrast. I don't know if you thought about it as you did this, but okay, so Sam, you just said we're just kids, we don't know everything. And so sure, that's true. And then this AI has an IQ of 150. However, I've not heard of an AI who had the idea of starting a podcast. And so there's an interesting contrast here with, so probably objectively, neither of you and neither of us and four of us collectively are as smart as an AI. And yet there's something that you did that is profound. And to your point, Sam, has sort of some knock-on possibilities in terms of getting people to think, that is fairly a natural thing. I mean, you're somewhat unusual in that you acted on it and put together a podcast. It was a good podcast, worth listening to, and all those kinds of things. But yeah, at the same time, it's a very human thing. Lots of people can do, and even people like David and I can figure out how to do podcasts. And yet it's dramatically and significantly different from AI. And so I don't know if you had thought about that, but as I was listening to your conversation, and then I was sort of thinking about, so AI is really fancy. And yet here's two young folks who say, hey, I want to think about this. And then they do that by creatively starting something and having a conversation. So I don't know if you want to kind of react to that a little bit in terms of, what makes you different from an AI, and what are some of the things that as your research looked at, did you come away more or less worried about the doomsday scenario?
So my thoughts also are kind of like the fact that AI requires prompts, and it requires kind of the green light to have the to like decide to do anything. So you have to tell it, go and do this for it to do anything. It's not spontaneous, and it's not like some people say it's conscious and it's living, but I mean, the definition of living is like a living organism. So I don't think that applies. And also the extent of AI is really dependent on the people managing it and the people who are in charge. And I think if AI goes out of control, it's because of lack of management, lack of like planning ahead. Because I think if someone told it to try and destroy humanity, there's a chance that it could do to some extent achieve that goal. But it would have to have, physical, like it would have to be able to use robots and stuff, which there aren't many around us that could actually hurt us. And also, to be quite honest, it's honestly, in my opinion, more dumb than smart. It can tell you things like you said, and I think that might have been what I brought up on the podcast, that it is taking already known things and just restating them basically, and just learning those things over. It's like a parrot. It's not. I would actually say it's not necessarily intelligent. I'm not sure exactly what IQ test we're doing, but it's not necessarily intelligent in the sense that it isn't spontaneous, and it can't create new ideas that are so different from already existing. Yes.
I actually gotta agree with you, Zach. I think that the reason it's smart is, again, AI is algorithms, just teaching the same thing. If you give a kid a test and you give the kid, you tell the kid, hey, this is what you did wrong, bang, 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 bang. And then you give him the same test, he's going to remember, okay, so he told me to do this, this, this differently. And so they get smarter and smarter. So they're just doing the AI is just doing the same test over and over again. That's why it's allegedly getting smarter. But in like smart, and again, like you said in Unbound, it's not how smart you are. It's, a test doesn't define you, really. So saying an AI is smart because of a test, because the IQ test says, oh, this is, no, it's not really. When we were researching the doomsday idea, the Terminator is coming, it's AI cannot think. It just does algorithms. Because when you look at AI generated picture, it takes two things, a microphone and a headphone, and then it smashes it together, but it can't integrate it together. If you know what I mean. Like you you can't come up with the idea of microphone inside the headset, like like a microphone with a headset. It can't come up with that, but it can smash two ideas and put it together. It can't make ideas like we humans, but only smash ideas that used to be together.
Some people even share their prompts, like the prompts for these generative AIs for images. They're so long, they're almost like an essay long sometimes. Really, but they are extremely long because the people are giving them the ideas. It's not coming up with its own ideas. And then also going off of Sam's idea of like the test example analogy, I think that's a great way to think about it, because when we ask it a question, it's basically telling you the answers to the tests it took. It's not actually, reasoning based off of what it learned to give you that answer.
So David, you and I talked about on Alternative Ideas podcast a couple times. We took a stab at what AI is, trying to just sort of, and you guys started on your podcast with what is the definition of it. What I hadn't thought about, and I just was prompted by our conversation here, was that in some sense the AI is the internet that can answer. It's the internet with a voice, and that's intriguing because we've never confused and thought the internet was alive. We sort of looked at the internet more as a tool, and so now all of a sudden it's like the internet has a voice and can almost do its own searches. But that's an interesting framing because you see the internet still as a system, and a system that requires input, and it's something that's used versus something that's sort of generating its own ideas, which I think is almost always the concern. You guys had some interesting theological implications, and I want to talk about that a little bit. But one of the ones I thought about that I don't think you discussed in the podcast, but I was thinking about as you were going through it, is that you talked a lot about what you guys just said, that and Sam, that it only has ideas that are put into it. It just rearranges it, pushes it, smashes those ideas together. I was wondering if you thought about and just react to, I thought, in some sense, there's an interesting reflection with AI that helps us see humanity in an interesting way. Because I think there's some theologians that would say that's the same as humanity, that humanity doesn't have original ideas. It thinks God's thoughts after him. And I don't know if that was something that occurred to you, or, give me some feedback on that statement, if that makes sense to you theologically. But I thought that was an interesting, as you were doing your podcast, I was thinking about the implication if AI is only smashing together thoughts that was given to us, move that up and sort of reverse it and think about us and our relationship to God.
I gotta agree. There is no such thing as a new idea. It's just the same. But the difference with AI and a human is its ability in curiosity. That's what I think. If you said, if I gave Zechariah a pig butter and a fire and told him make something, and I gave an AI a picture of butter and a fire and said make something, the AI would just put, butter with fire, or butter is on fire, or fire is with the butter. But Zechariah would be, oh, well, what if I put the butter onto the fire and then it melts and he makes melted butter? That's the difference. We're just reusing the same ideas over and over again. There's no such thing as a new idea. The microphone is just a metal tool that could just absorb sound, to tell you the truth. But someone had an idea. Where'd that come from? Well, it came from him hearing the sound in his ear. How did he hear it? Well, let's make something that's similar to that. And then he made the headphones, So it's not, the idea isn't we always have the same idea in a sense.
Yeah. Well, and something that we talked about in one of the episodes of our Alternative Ideas podcast was IQ versus EQ, and that being one of the biggest differences between how computers process things versus how we process things, because computers are very, very good at recognizing patterns and being able to interpret large sets of data. They're far and away going to be better at doing that than humans are. It's just how that's reality is and how they look at information. But what they don't have is the EQ of unique sets of experiences. And I think that's one of the things that I actually find most intriguing about you guys' podcast, is that kind of in your description of the podcast that you have, and you mentioned it earlier, is that you're really just thinking through things from a homeschool Gen Z perspective. And I thought that was really interesting because that is really, I think, something unique that not a lot of people necessarily get to hear from a lot. as far as perspectives that are thrown out online on a consistent basis unless you are within that specific sphere. So I just wanted to kind of ask you guys, why do you think that that was something that you really wanted to do, was to specifically have this podcast be a platform to kind of air this unique set of experiences that you guys are coming at these issues with?
I think having that perspective and putting that out there where people can hear it on like Spotify and on YouTube, I think is pretty significant. We'll see how, well known it becomes or how long it lasts. But as far as the perspective, I think not a lot of people, like you said, get to hear from that perspective. Even though there's a very large amount of homeschoolers, they're always very like small, very dispersed communities. There's not always very large, clumped up ones. Well, I go to a speech and debate club, which is like national, so there's like a lot of people there. But a lot of families are generally a part of smaller communities, and they're more invested in the community. And so a lot of times views are similar across all those different communities, but they aren't necessarily shared. But then they are within those communities, so they don't get shared outside of there. So this podcast might allow people who are in, let's say, like public school, where they're probably hearing very different things, or maybe, they have their own views that are separate from the public school, or people who are out of school who are listening to the news. There's some people like who you listen to can model how you think depending on how you process what you're hearing, which oddly enough kind of ties in, I guess, to AI and the way it works, but we go there just yet. But yeah, that's kind of, I guess, my idea is that just adding that perspective to the realm of podcasts kind of allows people to see what a lot of people don't know much about homeschoolers, and they don't really know where we're coming from. So I guess maybe opening up that door.
Well, and I think that's going to be a much more interesting perspective to look at over the coming years, because suddenly being homeschooled after 2020 is something that's a lot more common now. And I think a lot more people are kind of realizing the fact that there's kind of a group of people that were homeschooling a lot more before that. And now the homeschool culture has changed because of COVID and its implications. So I think it'll be really interesting to kind of hear a little bit more from this, because I mean, it's just interesting to hear from different generations of homeschoolers, because you guys' experiences have been far different from my experiences and from Jonathan's, and all of us were homeschooled.
You guys, with the conversation we had with AI for your podcast, you're representing, the first subject was AI. Obviously, it's not an AI podcast. And so that was interesting to talk about because there's a tie in there. But what's more interesting is your perspective, which David just touched on. So I wanted to ask you some questions from that perspective and make the turn here. And AI is an interesting foil for this because, all of a sudden we've got this technology that at the same time horrifies us and excites all these interesting emotions, right? I mean, you look at it and you think first thought is Terminator and second thought is, Iron Man being able to manipulate the stuff in the air and build all these really cool things, right? I mean, and it's almost simultaneous. So there's like the tantalizing part of it and the horror of it, which I think is not a bad reflection of the world we live in, which is always full of promise and mystery and excitement, and is also full of pain and suffering and stuff. And so that part's not new. The instant switch is new. You can turn on your computer and, yesterday I watched a short video of some people ice skating in Alaska on a frozen lake that had no snow. So it was clear as glass. So it was almost like you got vertigo skating on this. That's absolutely, beautiful. And I never would have seen that or thought about that before. And literally you can scroll up and the next video is of an atrocity committed somewhere in the world and the suffering that comes with it. And so that kind of schizophrenia, that shift is somewhat unique. So from your perspective, and Sam, we'll start with you. What are some of the things that, from your personal perspective, but, in the context of your generation, what are some things that worry you right now? What are the things that you actually do have some deep concerns about? And so this isn't going to stay depressing. We'll flip it here in a second and ask about the other side too. But start with you, Sam. What are some of the things that you are genuinely worried about from a generational perspective?
Our generation's kind of like, it's just weird. To tell you the truth, I believe 1,000 years ago, that generation Y was like yo, we're the worst generation. Like all this bad stuff is happening. The bomb was like the depression. Like for example, when World War I came, what do you think they were thinking about? Like, oh, this is the worst. It's the end. The end is coming. The end is coming. Like there's nothing. Like no generation is gonna have it worse than us. Next generation. Oh, like it's dry. Like depression just happened. Like guys, we're like people are homeless. This is the worst time in history, and this will be the end. Next generation. Oh, guys, it's looking pretty nice, but guys, there's still homeless people. We're in the middle class, and guess what? It's gonna erupt. There's gonna be another panic. The house are crashing. Like guys, like this is the worst generation. And then I believe again, I think this is the worst. Like, oh, we're in the suckiest generation, but I know the other generations are gonna go like, yeah, they were worse. Generation Z is just, it's just not very friendly. I started working a few weeks ago, and I met a girl who was the exact same age, like almost the exact, like a typical background, almost like me. The difference with me and her was she was a girl, I was a guy. She was public school, I was homeschooled, and so we had very different perspectives on that. And she really isolated me. She was like, "Oh, she was really nice." And then I told her, I was like, "Hey, I'm homeschooled," and she was like, "What? You're homeschooled?" And I'm, yeah, I believe in, and I told her what I believed in, and she was like, ugh. This generation, it's weird. They believe, and so I could just ramble on and on about like what's wrong with this, but I'll keep it short. It's just every generation is different, and they have different challenges that the generation previously and the generation after and before them will have to face. Before us was the crash, and after us it's going to be technology. It's going to be AI. They have to challenge that, and we are the guinea pigs. Our Generation Z, is the guinea pigs of how is humanity going to react to technology, and Generation Alpha is going to be how is the generation going to feel once immersed in that technology, and then Generation Beta is going to be what if your father's was submerged in technology and now you have it free. It's weird.
Zach, what do you think? What are some of the things that you worry about from a generational perspective?
Yeah, I would say I think there's one word that really comes to mind when I think about AI, especially lately, is that it's irresponsible. I think AI is a useful tool in some areas, but there are a lot of places it's been taken that are, I think, very irresponsible because people have a choice as to where they take these algorithms, what they do with them, and how they train them. And like opening all of these doors, I feel like so many of them is like, it's like they're opening Pandora's box. It's like so many problems are coming with it. With maybe there's benefits, but there's still so many issues that we need to deal with. And I honestly would say that there are already so many issues with, say, like our economy, society, and the internet, and we haven't even like gone through those yet. And now we're causing so many more issues that need to be dealt with. So I think, yes, there are cool applications for AI. There's entertaining applications for AI. There's useful ways to use AI. But I think it's really the fact that it hasn't really been limited is a bit of an issue. And people have this idea that if something can be done, it will be done and it has to. When that's not at all the case, I think when something can be done, we need to figure out what it is, what impact it might have, and whether we should do it. And if we shouldn't do it, we shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
So I think that's an issue.
I think that's called ethics. So
Yeah, probably.
Sam, you had a point you wanted to add there.
Yeah, I don't know why I have to dunk on my generation. I don't know why, but I have to. I gotta explain. I think there's three things that I actually just mentally Generation Z's the problem with is their ideas that they believe they're in a mentality set where my beliefs is my beliefs, your beliefs is your beliefs. Let's stay in our own little bubble. They like to think more idea based instead of logically based, which is like a huge problem in this society. I remember someone was pointing out, they were talking about, it was in a courthouse, and they were like, guys, we are arguing about defining what a woman is when our own aviation system is failing. There's some real problems out there. Why are we not dealing with those? Why are we talking about ideas instead of the logical? And yes, we Generation Z have been fed you could do the American dream. You could do whatever you want to be, whenever you want to be. You could be anything or everything, and you could do whatever you want. But when you grow up, they don't grow up. They're in that mentality set, and maybe you have to grow up a little bit that to get that logic. Go down to reason, due to logic. Like if the oceans are bad, well, let's just stop polluting them, guys. But they're like, no, 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 no. You guys can believe whatever you want to believe. If you won't believe the oceans are polluted, that's fine. But I believe they're absolutely safe. Let me just jump in. No, they're in their mental, and ideas. I also believe that most of the problems that Generation Z has is mostly in the U.S. because we're part of that 5% that are rich. If you live in the USA, I think you guys do, right?
We do, yeah.
We do. You guys are privileged. Like you're in a world where you're free. You get freedom of speech, press. We could talk about this podcast and we can say whatever we want, and it's free because God has given this land. And our generation is so privileged and so like sucked up and like pushed to this. It's the idea of weak men make hard times make strong men make weak times makes, and it goes on and on and on. And that's what I think this generation's happening. It's good times equal weak men, and that's what's happening right now. They've been pampered. They haven't been through the hardships of depression, the panics, the wars. They haven't seen any of that. They think it's a joke, and they make it a joke until one day it's gonna hit them hard, and it's gonna hit them fast. Reality is gonna hit them like a brick, and they're gonna realize, oh, we were in the greatness. Now we're not. Finally, it's mentality, like mental. Like there is a problem with our mentality and how they think. This generation. If you just look at stats of how much they like to hang themselves, how much it's a real problem. And I do believe some of that has to do with the system we are in, the economics, the schooling we're having, and technology. And I really think this is a problem for our generation. And I think they need to find a plan. They got to get a plan, a strategy, and stick to it, and just start to change a little bit.
There is a distinctly human desire to ignore good times and then reminisce about them later when they're over. And it's hard to recognize that you're in good times when you're in them. Zach, you had an additional thought, I believe.
Yeah, I was also thinking about how, like, he was talking privileges and how we are blessed with the opportunities we have. But I would actually say that when you're not taught how to deal with opportunities and how to take advantage of the opportunities you're given, this is actually something in Navigate that I think you kind of talk about, is that when you don't start going in a direction, you're not making any progress. But it's once you get started that you can actually change your direction and figure out where you need to go. And I think that's a big issue with our generation, is that we're not really, either we're not being taught or we're just ignoring the wisdom we're being given, and that we're expecting, to be given on a gold platter what we want or what we think we need, because we've been kind of, obviously everything we're saying is a bit of a generalization, but in general, especially at least what you see online of our generation, is that we've been taking so much for granted, and we don't really acknowledge that everything we have is an incredible blessing, and that, like, it's extremely significant that we have that.
Well, there's always two sides of the coin. And so, and Sam, you alluded to this earlier, that, every generation faces its challenges. And I think one of the things that I'm always a little bit interested in making sure that people remember is that, whatever challenges you're facing, in some ways they pale against other challenges, and in some ways they're unique. And that's not entirely a bad thing. I mean, we live in a fallen world, so there's going to be manifestations of evil, and some of them are going to be unique to our times. And so I'm always grateful that I don't have to deal with the Black Death, and I'm grateful that I don't have to deal with, well, the world in World War II. And yet at the same time, I acknowledge that some of the things that we are facing are unique and are challenging. That's not to say that we're living in grand times and everything's perfect. It's that there's a mix of those things. But there's also incredible opportunity. So while AI could represent an existential threat, it certainly represents possibilities to do some really ugly things. It also represents absolutely amazing technology. And so, again, this isn't about AI. We live in a world saturated by technology, not the least of which is the fact that two guys in high school who are homeschooled from Gen Z can put their thoughts out and listen, have the entire world listen to them. I mean, just the distribution opportunities are mind blowing to somebody that I don't consider myself particularly old despite appearances. And so, to me, this was not even imaginable when I was your age. Like nobody even thought about it. I mean, it would if we wanted to distribute our ideas at your age, it would have involved printing a magazine of some sort. And that would have involved, at the very least, paper and ink cartridges and, then the time to put them together and then a distribution, which would have been walking and sticking them in our friends' mailboxes or paying for postage. I mean, all of that was just an enormous undertaking. And so there's this kind of amazing opportunity here. So you guys are realists, and that's good. But I think to some level, listening to you, you're also a bit optimistic, and I think you ought to be. So, what are the things that are exciting to you? What are the things that you look forward to, and you say, "Hey, look at the amazing opportunity here"?
There's a lot of things that, are cool about this. I think generative AI specifically, does have a place in entertainment when it's used responsibly, because a lot of people can tell when it's generative AI, especially now, as far as videos go. And AI trying to create a video is very entertaining, I'll say that. But the only issue is as it gets better. But I think it does have a place, but I think where it has more of a place is places where people either aren't taking up responsibility in that area, or where people can't necessarily. For example, like an exploration robot that needs to go somewhere. If it's too dark for cameras to see, and if it's too dangerous and the cameras on the device can't necessarily see any dangers around it that might be important to notice, well, maybe not that. That might not be exactly the application, but places where it needs to be taken care of, but people can't necessarily like bring their attention to because maybe they're already occupied or some other emergency
Well,
shows up.
those are AI specific stuff, which is great. But just to drill down a little bit more, what are you personally, Zach, excited
Okay.
about? Like you're on the cusp of if you're bit to navigate, I would argue strenuously you're an adult, you're a young adult, right? And so you're a young adult moving into adulthood. And so more and more of your decisions and opportunities are going to be self-actualized, which means that you are going to be able to make the decision yourself. And so standing on that threshold, looking into the future, sure, there's things to be worried about, but what are you personally excited about?
I would say personally, there is lots of like potential for anyone who puts in the time and effort. And I think I would like love to be able to continue getting like the homeschool perspective heard, specifically Gen Z Christian homeschool. And I think I look forward to the opportunities that this gives and that I can take advantage of. And, a lot of people say, like, if you just put your time into it and keep working at it, it'll work. And that's true to an extent. You do have to kind of learn from your mistakes and all that. You can't just keep doing it over and over without thinking about it. But, there is the possibility, there's the potential to make at least my perspective heard as well as Samuel's. But just there's so much opportunity that is continuing to be opened up. And while it can be somewhat difficult to choose between different things, it does open up a lot of good doors, a lot of good opportunities that can benefit not just me or my community or my family, but also potentially our population, our world.
I gotta say, I'm glad I'm living in this generation, even though all the bad stuff are happening. I'm glad. I'm this. If you didn't know, I'm actually dyslexic, which means I have a disability. Well, not disability. I would say it's very hard for me to read or to write or to just do any of that. And living in the technology that we have now, it's not hard. I have audiobooks. We have podcasts, so I can listen to stuff, and that's been helping me. I've used Grammarly, which is it's AI. It's using AI. Think to the world, I can write better. And because of that, I've been able to catch up, if not exceed, my fellow classmates in how I do. And just, yeah, I do agree. I love that that in this day and age, we don't need to, as you said, we don't need to get the ink cartridges or the paper. We could just immediately do it. It's in the finger of our hand. You could start with you could do it with a phone. You could do it with a computer, any device you have. You could just, like that, you could just start something revelation or something, a doomsday. And I just am really excited to outspoke the homeschool community. But as again, me and Zechariah, we have the same ideas and perspectives. And I think what you said, David, that homeschooling is getting more broader perspective. I wouldn't be surprised in a few years from now, there's going to be different types of homeschooling ideas. And I think me and Zechariah are, we're just putting our ideas. But, in the future, the same way how there's Democrat and Republican, there's two different parties, there's evil and good. There's always two different. I wouldn't be surprised. There's homeschool and public school. I wouldn't be surprised within homeschool there would be a divide in belief, and idea, and how you should teach your kids.
Did you two know each other before you met through Equip?
Absolutely not.
Okay. And Zach, you said you're from Illinois. Sam, where are you from?
I'm from South Carolina. I was born in
Okay.
Miami, but I moved to South Carolina.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting thing all by itself, right? I mean, two people that have obviously a lot of things in common and a lot of things to say, but through technology, you get to meet through an educational system, but then through technology that allows the ongoing conversation and then the distribution of that conversation. That in itself is pretty remarkable. And to some extent, we take for a bit for granted, but if you sit back just a step or two, looks pretty miraculous. So, well, Zach and Sam, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I enjoyed the conversation. Lots of great things to be said. And I have a sneaking suspicion that we'll have some ongoing conversations. They may not be recorded, distributed, but I'm looking forward to some ongoing conversations inside the Unbound community and other places as well. And so thanks for taking the time to be here today. And thanks for taking the time to record your thoughts and get some much to do about out there and see if it's nothing or not with the work that you're doing on your podcast. We appreciate y'all joining us today.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Well, David, that was fun. I enjoyed the conversation. What did you learn from Zechariah and Samuel?
Oh, man. I think for one thing, I just so much appreciated that these are two 11th graders that are actively taking the time to engage in new ideas and in challenging or complex conversations with each other. And I think one of the things I most appreciated about them is that they said, hey, we're 11th graders. We don't know everything. We're just out here having these discussions, trying to figure things out as we go along and just do the best we can. We're not putting ourselves out as experts. This is just our perspective. And I think that that's really valuable to be able to hear, is that I think a lot of people who start podcasts, especially, obviously not us, but a lot of people who start podcasts very much think of themselves and put themselves out there as experts. And not everybody has to be an expert. Sometimes you can just be really interesting to listen to. And I think that is definitely the case with these two guys.
Well, they had such interesting commentary in their name, Much Ado About Nothing. And I didn't know if that was
Mhm.
ironic or what, but Sam had a really, really interesting perspective on that and why they named it that, and their hope that, they start a conversation and gets out there. But I just thought they were pretty humble about, look, we're learning from each other here. And after the recording stopped, they were telling us about some of their desires for some future podcasts that they've recorded already. I haven't published yet, including some ones where they're kind of learning from each other on air. And it was pretty neat. There's a humbleness there. There's a desire to learn. There's obviously some native Gen Z ability to use technology. And all those things were fun to discuss with them, and it was a good conversation. So we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And if you enjoyed it, and if you were impressed by Sam and Zach like we were, we'll just remind you that they're our students. And so this was a segment where we got to feature our own students. Honestly, we could probably draw names out of a hat and put them on the podcast, and they would have interesting stories. And so hopefully that was intriguing to you. And if you were intrigued by it, then check out the program that Sam and Zach are in. And that would be our Equip program, specifically for high school students, 9th, 10th, and 11th graders. And it is a program that is designed specifically to help students actualize their education. In other words, whatever education they're doing, Equipped gives them the skills to take what they're learning from their curriculum, what they're learning through their courses, their history and their science and their math and all those things, and be able to apply that both directly. So obviously, if you need to solve a math problem, you need to use math. But often we have situations where somebody says, "Why am I learning algebra?" Well, it is true that if you're not an engineer and you're not in a very specific type of job, that you may never use algebra again. But we teach students in Equip is that the process of learning algebra, particularly if you're not good at it, that process is actually the transferable skill. Now, that's not intuitive. In other words, that is true, but it's not necessarily the first thing people think about. And so Equip is a program designed to help you think about that directly. And so that any kind of educational process on any kind of subject, to help you take the skills that you're learning in learning that, and to say that those things are transferable and to apply that to other parts of life. And I think these two young men were really interesting examples how to do that. But I also want to illustrate something else that we kind of talked about at the end. They did not know each other prior to being in Equip. And one lives in Illinois and one lives in South Carolina. And I think from our perspective, we could not do more to point that out and endorse that and say part of what happens with the young people that we have in Equip and in Explore, which is our high school program for 12th graders, and in Ascend, which is our flagship program for post high school, and even in our students who join us for our Navigate courses, is that we get to build this unique community of students who share a lot of the same values in terms of their faith, but also in terms of willing to be doing something different for education, a desire to learn and a desire to do something with what they're learning, like Zach and Sam are doing. And when you put those people together, some really cool things happen. That is the heart of what Unbound is about. It is about attracting and connecting extraordinary young people and young adults, and then seeing what happens. And one of our great joys is that Dave and I get a ringside seat to see some of the cool stuff that happens. So if that sounds intriguing to you, please go to beunbound.us, beunbound.us, and learn more about us on the website there, or give us a call. We'd be delighted to talk to you.
If you were at all interested in more content about AI, Jonathan and I actually did a podcast for about 9 episodes over the summer about AI and talking about some of the implications of it and some of the currently developing topics around it from when we recorded it. So if you want to check out that podcast and listen back through some of our thoughts about those things, then that podcast will also be linked in the show notes down below.
Until next time, we will remind you to be unbound.